Reflections with theologian Father James Bacik, lecturer and campus minister at the University of Toledo.
But to hear those lectures was an exciting thing for me. The church was packed, and Kung, his passion was evident. He was really concerned about this question of truthfulness in the church. He spoke out against all of the duplicity that he saw in the church, and he called for a rigorous candor in dealing with these questions.
Today on Reflections, Father Bacik talks with Father James Bryan, who is pastor of St. Pius X Church in Toledo, Ohio. Father Bacik and Father Bryan will discuss Hans Kung, truthfulness in the church. And now, here is Father Bacik.
Well, Jim, it's nice to have one of my favorite theological dialogue partners on the program. You and I have talked often about theological matters. That's a passion we have in common. We like to read theology, study it, and talk a lot about it. I guess for you and for me, that it's an exciting kind of discipline, and so I always enjoy our conversations. You ready for a little theological discussion?
I always find you a challenge and an interesting partner, yes.
Good, Jim. I want to talk a little bit about the topic of truthfulness in the church and want to use the theology of Dr. Hans Kung to try to get at this a bit. And let me start out by dealing a little bit with the problem of truthfulness. I recently did a little listening session with some faculty members at the university and found them to be asking very probing questions about the state of things in the church and looking really for very honest answers. They were asking about financial questions in the Vatican. They wanted to know about marriage procedures, about how we end up with documents talking about homosexuality and on medical ethics and so on. They had a really probing attitude about all of that, and it seemed to me they were looking for honest answers. And my sense is that in part of their comments, I suppose, suggested that they often didn't get honest answers, that they felt that when they were searching or questioning things within the church that it was sort of off limits, or it was hard to find someone who would speak candidly about faults and failings within the church. So I think that we do have a problem here with this truthfulness question, and maybe we can think a little bit about how the problem presents itself to us as people interested in theology or as pastors and the people that we serve. I know I must say my own sense of it is that truthfulness often does help a lot. I mean, to respond with just candidness to some of those hard questions, I think seems to diffuse some of the negative energy to begin with.
Pastorally speaking, one often finds there is a pastoral pattern that's very much consistent with the faith of the church, and yet if one spends too much energy trying to see how this fits into documents and what the documentary statements are, you find yourself either tongue-tied or else unable to coincide the two sources there. I think Kung was attracted by the complexity of that issue. Can a document summarize the experience of grace? And if so, then what normative procedures we follow the cause of that? And I feel that a lot of the criticism he had on truthfulness in the church was simply a call to try to adjust, to bring together that kind of complexity.
You're talking about some of your own pastoral problems. I know I talk to priests at times who do have troubles along this line, and I'm trying to think, especially in terms of defending particular church practices that maybe they find to be themselves not very defensible, or at least they have questions about them, and they often aren't too sure of how to proceed in this kind of situation. So I think there are certain problems built in for the clergy, and I think the lay people as well feel it, not from the viewpoint of being the ones preaching about all of this, but having questions posed to them by their friends and having to deal with their own doubts in these matters. I think it's important to remember that a lot of church practices are things that can be changed and often are changed, and I don't think that we really have to be in a position of defending absolutely every practice within the church, because, as a matter of fact, they probably aren't all defensible. We could think these days a lot of people have trouble with some of the procedures around annulments for marriages, for example. There's a lot of publicity about that sort of thing. And so we do have a real ongoing problem, I suppose, with truthfulness in the church.
I would suggest that it's even part of a larger anthropological question in a society. What is the cohesive factor of the society? Is it the rules, or is it the stability of the interrelatedness of the people. For some anthropologists, they try to keep the two working together, and they can point to certain societies that do that. But when the rules, the doctrinal statements, seem to be the binding force, usually the corresponding experience is the community is weakened, and because all of its attention goes towards preserving, defending, identifying the rules.
So you're asking us to look at a sort of almost a deeper notion of what truth is.
Mm-hmm.
The truth has to do with the most fundamental values and outlooks and perspectives that bind a community together, and that we need to be faithful to that line of thought or of that particular ethos, and not so much in the way it's codified, not so much in the way it ends up in particular laws or in even particular statements. Not the thrust of what you're saying?
Precisely. And one of the defects in this process is that very often people have not been trained on how to listen to the church. So we have a statement such as Humani Vitae, the birth control encyclical of Paul VI, which raised so much flack at that time, in which we have a typical Roman document of saying, this is our teaching, we expect the adherents of the church to listen to this. Listening meaning taking it in, drawing complexity from it, letting that complexity modify your life attitude, and then responding appropriately, maturely, under grace. And so we find people themselves saying, I'd like it simply yes or no. And there is a lack of complexity there on their part. And I think that when the Krum comes in and says, you want to get down to the truthfulness of the issue, because the challenge is typically Roman, goes back a lot older than the church, the great lawgivers of Rome, would say, here is what we tell you to do. We don't care if you do it or not, but just say it's the right thing to do. And if you break the rules, we have all kinds of sanctions to help you get over that, sacramental sanctions and so forth. But Krum has called people and said, well, let's try to get closer to the truth of the matter that lies in each
When you were trying to root this in a cultural kind of setting, I was trying to think of an example, and I'm not sure I was able to come up with any, but I mean, for example, in our country, we could think of the prohibition laws, and I suppose the prohibition laws didn't work because they really didn't reflect the deepest feelings of most of the people in the United States. I mean, they seem as though they were the product of people who wanted a more puritanical ethos to really prevail within the country. And I think that maybe it didn't work for that reason. There was some sort of deeper truth in the country that said something about people having freedom in relationship to alcohol. Not that it's great to drink too much, but that it wasn't the right place to be setting these kind of limits. Maybe that would be an example of where we ended up with a codified law that really didn't fit what people were thinking and feeling in the country. Therefore, there was a deeper truth about the consumption of alcohol all through that period. And people very often broke the law probably because they felt something in tune with that deeper spirit. There ought to be freedom on that question. And then you were taking that to the church level then. And as you were talking, I was thinking about that statement that, well, the church in Rome makes the laws, but the people in the United States are the only ones who think you have to keep them all so strictly. That there is a Roman notion that, as you said, laws are proposed and you're supposed to give some sort of assent to them, but that there's all kinds of pastoral care for those who break the laws. There's all kind of sense of empathy for those who can't live up to these laws. I think that's commonly felt in other countries, and something that maybe here in the United States we haven't quite caught up with, or at least don't see it in the same way.
Also, the tendency very often is that when an experience seems to be have gone mayhem, we cannot address this issue properly. It seems there's a plethora of more documents coming out. The more documents one produces, somehow they're addressing the real situation. Very often provides more material to be worked with. But the tendency seems to be then, because if it doesn't bind the people together, then all they need is another document to help explain it. And very often the issue lies elsewhere.
Okay, let's look at Hans Kung a little more closely and try to see what he has to tell us here about this whole question of truthfulness in the church. I can start out with a personal remembrance, and that is back in 1968, I think it was, 67, 68, I was studying in New York at the time, and Hans Kung was a visiting professor at Union Theological. In fact, I had him for class then on a course called Ecumenical Sacramentology. It's the only sacramental course I could ever remember that began with talking about Luther and Luther's notions of the sacraments. It was a very ecumenical, wide-based approach to the way we would examine sacramental life in the church. But in the evenings during that semester, he lectured at the Riverside Church on the very topic of truthfulness in the church. It was later published as a book entitled Truthfulness, the Future of the Church, came out in 1968 by Sheed and Ward. But to hear those lectures was an exciting thing for me. The church was packed, and Kung, his passion was evident. He was really concerned about this question of truthfulness in the church. He spoke out against all of the duplicity that he saw in the church, and he called for a rigorous candor in dealing with these questions. There were people ready to march with him at that time. He's no doubt a charismatic figure. To locate him just a little bit more, he is a Swiss priest, studied in Rome and went there in 1948 to the Gregorian University, wrote his doctoral dissertation on the great Protestant theologian Karl Barth, and I suppose first became famous with a book entitled The Council, Reform, and Reunion, which he wrote right before the Second Vatican Council started in 1962, and they picked up a lot of ideas from Yves Congar, another great giant of Catholic theology in the 20th century. And I think that in that way, Kung really made his mark as one of these reforming-type theologians. He became well-known, made many lecture tours of the United States, I think 5 of them at least. He's lectured at the University of Toledo in the recent past, and has lectured up in Ann Arbor, and he has become well-known, I suppose, one of the best-known of Catholic theologians of the 20th century. There's a whole lot more we could say about him as a person or in his career, but at least to locate him a little bit. And that takes me back to 1968 and those marvelous lectures in Riverside Church on truthfulness in the church. So let's look a little bit, Jim, or anything. Did you want to add something about him personally at all? I mean,
no, the charismatic features of course, he spoke in Washington in 1953. At that time, it was controversial enough that they did not allow him to speak at the public platform, so they went over to the Jesuit University.
They wouldn't let him speak at Catholic University.
Right, because it's controversial, and we might get into the effect of controversy in the church, all the things that arise from the very fact he raises that as an issue.
Now, that's amazing, isn't it? Back in 1963, to fill out that picture a little bit, there was sort of a whirlwind tour I think he made of the United States and made quite an impact, and they got a lot of media coverage. He always does in what he is about. But he was also an expert at the council, not at the first session, but beginning the second session. And thus saying that at that same time he was considered to be an important enough man and orthodox enough theologian to bring him right into the centers of power and to have him influencing what was going on at the council. So there's a very ambivalent feeling about Kung all the way through, and maybe we'll just leave it go at that. As you said, he's controversial, and part of it is because he's so charismatic. I mean, extremely vibrant fellow, and makes a great appearance, and is a striking figure, and he gives his speeches with great gusto and so on, and he is able to move audiences, and he really does play to the media in many ways. Again, maybe you can talk more about that in some other context, but let's go back now to this truthfulness question, because he really is harsh on the church in many ways. He's harsh on almost all segments of the church for not being truthful in the whole approach to living out the gospel. I think his notion of truthfulness is probably much akin to what you were saying before. I have a quote here I want to read from that book, The Truthfulness, where he said, "We must really adopt a really fundamental attitude in life through which individuals or communities," and I think that's important, it's personal truth, but also the way the community acts, "in spite of difficulties, remain true to themselves, without dissimulation and without losing their integrity. A genuine candor with oneself, with one's fellows, and with God. A genuine candor in thought, word, and deed." Now, I think that gets close to what you were saying, that notion of being truthful to oneself, faithful to our own best ideals, and so on. It's a statement of truthfulness that's not just, well, the sentence I say must accord with reality, but it's more in my lifestyle, in my bearing, in the way I live out the gospel. I must show a fundamental fidelity to the call of Christ. That has to be really primary with me.
Mm-hmm.
Now, when we're trying to look at this, maybe start out with the community idea, because here he faults one of the communities. He faults are the theologians, and he thinks a lot of times that theologians have not been very truthful because of the way they will fudge questions. One of them he used to talk about is that idea of no salvation outside the church. Now that was a traditional doctrine. It goes all the way through the history of Catholic thought. No salvation outside the church. Now, when someone like our mentor, Karl Rahner, gets a hold of that kind of sentence, he ends up reinterpreting it, and Kung really makes fun of this at one point, and saying, well, what happens is that the statement, no salvation outside the church, is reinterpreted to such a degree that it turns out to mean exactly the opposite of the obvious meanings of the words, that there is salvation outside the church.
That's why Rahner was never banned, and Kung was.
That's a good point, Jim.
Yeah. Always. Yeah.
A telling point. In other words, Rahner was always interested in saying how preserving what was said before and showing how there was some truth in it. And Kung's theory of it is, if you're going to be truthful, what you would say is, we were wrong about that, and now we see it differently, and let's admit we were wrong and go forward from there.
He does say that, but I find difficulty in that. But that, to me, puts everything in a black and white world. This is wrong and this is right, and now all we need to do is muster our energies and we'll come to truth. And I see truth as far more in process, and I'm amazed, because I do not think he sees it that way in black and white terms. He was able to reconcile what had been so long a point of division among theologians, Catholic and Protestant, on justification by faith with works and so forth, did a marvelous accord. In that complexity of thought, I'm not sure many people could understand either what Barth or Kung were saying, but the two theologians said, substantially, we agree. The work then becomes part of the pastoral part of the church, how to translate that in everyday experience.
So what you're saying is that Kung himself did have a sense of complexity, because he took a 400-year-old dispute between Protestants and Catholics on the question, are we justified by faith or by works, and showed how there was fundamental agreement.
Mm-hmm.
And both Rahner and Barth, Karl Barth being the great Protestant theologian of the 20th century, and Karl Rahner being the great Catholic theologian, looked at Kung's dissertation, that was his doctoral dissertation, and said, and Barth said, yes, he does actually represent my thought, and Rahner looked at it and said, yes, he does accurately represent Catholic thought, and yet he had shown how they could be reconciled.
Precisely. And I think one of the impetuses for his criticism of the church also involves two great divergencies. Is the church the sinless bride of Christ, which has sort of been one image, another that the church is only an invisible collection of holy people we can't identify yet, very Swiss Calvinistic interpretation of the church. And I think he was trying to say, in criticizing the church, no, the church has many wrinkles in it, many faults. Let's point that out so we don't pretend we are either holier than thou. At the same time, we are preserving ourselves as a mixed kettle of fish. We are the net that has all stinking kind of fish with the good ones.
Yes, and he translated that very often into his notion that the church was a sinful church, and that we needed to admit that. And not only is the church a sinful church, but the church is a human church. A great emphasis. He was not fond of speaking of the church in divine terms. His emphasis was on the human side of the church. The church is a collection of human beings. And again, he would fault Rahner for his anonymous Christian notion, which sort of makes everyone, in a way, a member of the church. Kung was much more rigid about that. He says, no, the only people who are members of the church are baptized and who profess that Jesus Christ is the Lord. In other words, it's a very explicit church, a very clear-cut church in one way. And he said, that church is made up of human beings. It's not the kingdom of God. It's a sinful humanity wending its way through, but always convinced of the lordship of Christ and relying on the power of the Spirit. And therefore, that was, I suppose, the basis for why he would end up calling for truthfulness in the church, because let's get it straight right away. We are limited, we make mistakes, and we're off the mark at times, we're sinful, and yet God somehow remains faithful to us, and the Spirit remains with this church. So if we can admit that fundamental thing, then we ought to be in a position to deal with all these minor questions that need candid kind of responses.
I think what strikes me about him is that he has the passion of the visionary who's suddenly been enlightened. And I think automatically people bristle when they find someone leaping upon them with enlightenment. And looking upon what he sees, I said, well, I've seen this all along. Isn't it self-evident? Is he a showman? But then you find from within the church critics trying to say, hey, keep it quiet. This really isn't this way at all. And you say, oh, maybe he has something to say here. Yeah. And it's amazing because in one side you have the antinomian theory. If we don't have a lot of statements and rules and documents, then we'll be absolutely without guidelines whatsoever. On the other hand, if we don't make these documents, these rules, absolutely permanent for the rest of eternity, the all hell will break loose. And so we have such things as the Mass must be in Latin until the end of the world by the Council of Trent. And I think it's Pius V said that. So then you say, well, let's look, we were wrong, or if we weren't wrong, there's more here to experience.
Yes. I think that Kung, in other words, thinks that if the church is really going to be a faithful bride to Christ, and it's going to be really in the business of reform, at the bottom it will have to be truthful. It will have to end up saying, admitting sinfulness, admitting particular mistakes, and as a basis for saying, now we're going to do better. We're going to reform ourselves out of this whole sense of truthfulness. So that the community itself would have to make a lot of adjustments in Kung's mind.
Which I find a disappointment in Kung, because when you come, for instance, to the liberation theologians, one finds they talk about systemic injustice. Therefore, if there is truthfulness in the church, then one must work either to remove systems or overthrow systems, to find new systems, and to admit that one's own systems are themselves evil. Now, that has an anthropology to it, which I don't think I am fully in touch with. But when Kung calls for reform of systems, of the society, the community itself, so it can really witness Jesus Christ to the world, I would say, well, certainly we have to. Could you get more particular? What is it you see wrong? When he points out to inconsistencies in how things are brought to the divine sacred rota, or how women are treated in the church, then you find, well, maybe he has something concrete here.
Yeah, well, he does really have a whole list of things in that book and those lectures that I heard him give. He talked about the reorganizing the curia, that he felt the curial offices in Rome, those offices that assist the Pope in managing or administering the church, really needed reorganization. He didn't find a whole lot of truthfulness in those offices. I think he thought of them as sort of bureaucrats who mouthed a party line without really trying to be faithful to Jesus Christ. And as I say that, I realize, Jim, that I don't think we've made that clear enough. When Kung talks about the ultimate truthfulness here and being true to self, it really is it's being true and faithful to Jesus Christ, because he is the norm for Kung always. The Christ that's proclaimed in the Scriptures is the one that we need to have allegiance to. That allegiance to Christ comes, in a sense, before our allegiance to the church. What you'd like is to have those the same. But if there is some sort of dichotomy, then the Christian has to go with allegiance to Christ and critique the church in the light of that primary allegiance. That is absolutely crucial in Kung's thought. And I think his sense was that the curial people don't seem to operate that way, that they are faithful first to the church and then are thinking of Christ later. And I think I'm just reporting what he says there, but as I say it, it seems to me that that's probably a criticism across the board that many of us could fall into. And many of us who are tightly bound up with the church, I think, would have to be careful of that temptation.
I think there's an optimism, though, in thinking that it can be reformed. It's one thing to say the office has become bureaucratic and it's filled with company men who will simply say yes to the higher up. And the other thing to say, well, we don't need offices whatsoever. We are totally charismatic. Kung does have the conviction that the offices can be reformed.
Yes, and that they are important. Yes. I think we have to get that in there. There's really two kinds of problems he sees. One is sort of the Catholic problem here, where we would just sort of say yes to the institution without thinking about Christ. But then he sees sort of a Protestant problem as well, where they end up with sort of an individualistic notion of truth. and they're going to be faithful to their own truth as they see it. It becomes too subjective in his mind, and so he does not really move in the totally classic Protestant framework here. Kung wants to stay within the institution. In fact, he says that if we pursue truth, it always has to be within a community, so that our individual perceptions of it are modified by what the community says, and that it really needs to be faithful to the common good as well. Mm-hmm. And I think that's an important thing to keep in mind here as we try to get a sort of a balanced picture of what Hans Kung is all about. So, Jim, we're talking about this truthfulness here in the church, and looking at Hans Kung for some sort of guidance in this. We began by talking about the pastoral dimension, and saying that in many ways we do see the problems here, that many of our people in our congregations are looking for great candor from the church. They expect us to give honest answers to their questions, and I suppose they're often very disappointed if they don't get those, especially if they don't get them from the officials in the church that they ought to look up to. And bad things happen in that case. Oftentimes people end up turning off the authority figures in the church. But then we also have the how we're going to respond to that, and we're trying to look at the Swiss theologian, Hans Kung, who has really been a major mover in the reform in the church in the 20th century, and who sort of blossomed right at the time of the Second Vatican Council, has become well known through his lecture tours around the country. And Kung is calling us to a truthfulness, and as you well point out, a deep truthfulness, which is finally a fidelity to Jesus Christ. And that truthfulness is carried out in a communal setting, first of all, within the church. Church institutions have to try to be truthful, church officials, and then also in a personal setting, that we have to be in touch with our own sense of things and try to be candid in the way we respond. And in this way, I suppose Hans Kung really does give us a really challenge to say, let's be truthful people living the faith out within the church.
You've been listening to Reflections with theologian Father James Bacik, lecturer and campus minister at the University of Toledo. Today, Father Bacik talks with Father James Bryant, who is pastor of St. Pius X Roman Catholic Church in Toledo, Ohio. The topic of this week's Reflections was Hans Kung, Truthfulness in the Church. If you have any comments on today's show or suggestions for future programs, please write Father James Bacik, Catholic Campus Minister, 2086 Brookdale Drive, Toledo, Ohio, 43606. Funding for this program was provided by the Catholic Communications Commission of the Diocese of Toledo.